The last 20 years, there's been an explosion of research about gangs and gang members. But what we're lacking at this point in time is an integration of that research and then a platform to help define where future research should go. And so this current article is an example to look back over that past 20 years, synthesize what we've learned, and then establish a set of questions and a foundation that can lead gang research over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. What we've done in summarizing and synthesizing the last 20 years of gang research is look at what researchers call the different levels: individual, group, and then larger state, city, neighborhood, what we call macro level. The individual level has been the area where there's been the most research over the past 20 years. And what gang researchers have done in the course of that is to look at risk factors. The examination of risk factors has been important in a variety of other areas: education, public health, drug abuse. And it's been incorporated into gang research in, I think, some very important ways, and ways that allow us to better understand when a youth is on the path to becoming a gang member, and I think equally importantly, when they're not. Some of the key risk factors that stand out for young people who are on the way to becoming gang members are significant negative life events, so witnessing the death of a friend, the death of a parent, the abuse of a parent, watching mom or dad get arrested, holding negative social beliefs. In other words, beating people up is okay, it's okay to steal from people, having peers who are involved in crime and deviant activities. But what we found is, in synthesizing and looking over dozens and dozens of studies, is that it's not just one or two of these factors, it's the accumulation of multiple risk factors that put youth most at risk for joining a gang. The irony about gang joining is that in most studies, gang members report that they joined the gang for protection. The exact opposite is what happens when they join the gang. Gang members are at increased risk for being victims of crime, especially violent crime. And so that's an important consequence of gang membership. But another consequence, and maybe even more important, is that upon joining a gang, an individual's probability of being involved in crime increases dramatically, perhaps 2 or 3 times what it was before they were a member of the gang. And equally important, when they exit the gang, that involvement in crime declines, although typically not quite to their pre-gang levels. There are a variety of other consequences. There are consequences for educational attainment that are negative. There are consequences for employment that are negative. There are consequences for family relationships that are negative. So on balance, gang membership produces a number of negative consequences for young people who make that decision to join, and the longer they stay, the more of those negative consequences occur and the more serious they are. Perhaps the most difficult challenge in studying individual gang members or even gangs is the challenge of tracking them over time. One of the things we know about humans is that they evolve and they change over time, and that values and beliefs and activities and friends that are important at one time, say 15 years of age, have changed by 17 years of age. And if all we do is survey or interview individuals at a single point in time, then we miss that change. The obvious, the very important circumstance in which measuring gang members over time is being able to examine their behavior and beliefs and friends before they join a gang, while they're in the gang, and then after they leave. And only by doing that can we isolate the independent effect of gang membership on their behavior. I think the single most important thing to know about the micro level of gang membership, the individual level, has to do with the risk factors. And that gang membership presents risk factors over and above what individuals bring to their gang. What we argue is that gang research has been characterized by work that's looked at those individual factors, the macro factors like neighborhoods, cities, states, counties, and a much smaller number of studies that have looked at what we call group process. And it's there where the individual and the macro intersect and work together. There's something different about being in a gang than being in other groups. And we think, and the research shows, that group process is the single most important thing that a gang brings to individual behavior. What we mean by group process is the ability of a group to influence an individual to do things that they might not otherwise do without the presence of that group there. So many of the young people who've been interviewed who are gang members on their own wouldn't be likely to engage in some of the violence, much of the violence, some of the drug sales, some of the property crime, some of the really egregious behavior that causes us, many of us, to scratch our heads and say, why would someone do this? Someone would do this because they're part of a group, and that group has values and that group has behavior that encourages people to do things they wouldn't normally or otherwise do. The macro level is an important perspective as well when trying to understand what we know about gangs. And it is in part informed by our knowledge about the general distribution of crime. So for example, a study from the 90s found that in the District of Columbia, less than 4% of the addresses in the city accounted for over 80% of the crime. So if we're trying to look for places to intervene, what we want to do is intervene in places that have very high levels of crime. This tends to be the case in most cities. St. Louis is a place where a lot of gang and homicide violence research has taken place. In St. Louis, a city of 78 neighborhoods, only 15 of those neighborhoods account for over half, nearly 60% of all the violent crime. So there's tremendously high concentrations of crime, gun crime, and violence. What we find when applying that logic to the study of gangs is that the same thing results, is that gang membership is concentrated in a relatively small number of neighborhoods. And that has implications for us both on the one hand of trying to understand gangs, but also on the other hand of trying to respond. So when we build our interventions and we work on our policies, we need to be very careful about tailoring them to the places where gang membership is highest and making sure that we put those interventions in the places where gang membership is greatest and of most concern, because then those interventions are likely to do the most good. I think there are a couple things that when we look at the accumulated wisdom of the last 20 years that are really important to understand about gangs. The first is that gang membership has been relatively constant over the last 10 years. There are about 750,000 gang members in the United States, at least according to police sources, and that's remained relatively constant. And we think that in combination with another finding from multiple studies, the fact that gang membership tends to last on average less than 2 years is really important, because what that means is there's a cycling in by the part of 15, 16, 17-year-olds, but an equally large cycling out on the part of 16, 17, 18-year-olds of gang members. If gang members didn't cycle in and out, then that number of 750,000 would have changed over time. But that cycling in and cycling out leads us to want to understand more about not only what causes people to join gangs, because we've studied that a lot. What I think may be equally important is where we've not paid enough attention, and that is what causes and what helps young people to get out of gangs. In some of the work that's been done interviewing people who were gang members and have left their gang, We find very little evidence that a program led them to get out of a gang. We find lots of evidence that what we call maturational reform, getting a little older, growing out of it, getting a job, having a family, getting back in school, growing up, if you will, are the sorts of things that help people, natural social processes that help people get out of gangs. And we think for the sake of intervention, paying attention to those natural maturational processes could really pay dividends in building interventions. I think the most important takeaway from the paper is the need to integrate our understanding of gangs and gang members across the individual, the group process, and the macro level, so that if we can track individuals over time, measure the group process, and add our understanding of neighborhoods to that, we'll have a much fuller picture. It would be like trying to study the human anatomy, but only looking at the circulatory system without looking at other parts of human anatomy, like skeleton or digestive. And what we argue is that the way ahead is the integration of multiple perspectives. We recognize that's difficult. We recognize that it's not easily done, but there's emerging work in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Boston, that is doing just that. And we think in the future that will be where the big advances come from.